Before we go any further, you need to see this footage. What you are about to watch is so shocking that it speaks for itself. One look is enough to see that something extraordinary just happened, and the meaning of it is much bigger than it first seems. What you are watching right now happened over Isfahan, Iran, and it is not a small event. This is an underground missile storage complex cut deep into a mountain and packed with ballistic missile stockpiles, and it just got introduced to a 5,000 lb guided penetrator bomb. The weapon in question is the GBU-72, and if you have been with us for a while, you know we do not just show you the explosion and move on. We are going to break down exactly what this bomb is, why the Pentagon reached for this specific weapon instead of anything else in the arsenal, what Iran is saying in response, and what all of this means for where this war goes from here. So grab a coffee, settle in because we have a lot of ground to cover today, and stick around because later on we are going to swing the cameras over to Isfahan ourselves and take a look at exactly which bunker complex likely just got hit. Let's start with what we are actually looking at. This explosion is coming out of a mountain south of Isfahan, and I want you to notice something specific about the way this blast behaves. It is not one flash and then it is over. It keeps going. You get this rolling chain reaction eruption that keeps venting out of the mountainside long after the first impact, and that is not some camera trick. That is physics. When a penetrator warhead gets deep enough into a hardened underground facility before it blows, all of that explosive energy has nowhere to go. It gets trapped inside solid rock and reinforced concrete. So instead of one clean boom, you get pressure building up and finding every weak point, every ventilation shaft, every access tunnel, and venting through all of them one after another. If that facility was storing ballistic missile stockpiles, and multiple reports right now say that it was, then what you are watching is secondary detonations, propellant, ammunition cooking off inside the mountain, one after another, because the main strike found its mark. Now, here is the part that really matters if you want to understand why this specific bomb was chosen. This is being reported as the GBU-72, which the Air Force also calls the Advanced 5K Penetrator. And it is a $5,000 B-class precision-guided bunker-busting bomb that has been in the inventory since around 2021. And it is designed to be carried by platforms like the F-15E Strike Eagle and the B-1B. Think of the family of penetrator weapons like a toolbox. At the very top end, you have the GBU-57, the massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000 LOB monster that only a B-2 can carry, saved for the absolute hardest targets buried under mountains of rock, the kind of target we saw hit at the very start of this war. Below that, you have 2,000 LOB class weapons like the BLU-109 warhead riding on a JDAM kit, which is a solid bunker buster, but has real limits on how deep and how thick a target it can chew through. The GBU-72 sits right in the gap between those two. It gives commanders a weapon that can punch through serious rock and reinforced concrete, but it does not require scrambling a B-2 stealth bomber and flying it halfway around the world to do it. And that gap is exactly the problem Iran has been building around for decades, hardening facilities so they sit below what a 2,000 lb bomb can defeat, while betting the US would not want to burn a B-2 sortie on every single target. The GBU-72 closes that gap, and that is exactly why it is becoming the workhorse weapon of this campaign. Let's talk about what makes this weapon truly impressive from an engineering standpoint. Because there is more to it than just being heavy. A bunker buster is not built to explode on contact like a normal general-purpose bomb. If it did, it would just blow up on the surface and barely scratch whatever is underneath. Instead, this thing is built with a hardened steel casing so it can survive smashing through earth, rock, and concrete without breaking apart. And it carries a delayed fuse that waits, counting through the layers of material it is punching through, and only detonates once it reaches the depth it was aimed for. Reporting on this weapon class describes it as able to punch through around 100 FET of earth and more than 20 FET of solid concrete before that fuse finally lets go. So picture it like this. Iran spent decades building what is basically an underground city carved into a mountainside, engineering it specifically to survive a normal bombing campaign. And what this weapon does is arrive, ignore the mountain's defenses completely, and detonate exactly where the enemy believed the rock itself would protect them. It is less like blowing a hole in the roof, and more like the weapon simply refusing to admit that the roof was ever there. There is also a guidance feature on this bomb that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it tells you a lot about how flexible modern airstrikes have become. This weapon can be used purely as a GPS-guided munition, meaning a weapon systems officer in the back seat of the Strike Eagle can program in a fixed set of coordinates before the jet even leaves the ground, then simply release the weapon over the target area and let it fly itself in. But it can also be flown in laser-guided, with the crew actively lasing the target and making live corrections as the bomb falls. And here is the clever part. If that laser designation gets broken, whether by cloud cover, smoke from earlier strikes, evasive maneuvering because of a surface-to-air missile threat, or anything else, the weapon does not just go dumb and miss, it automatically switches back to guiding on the last known GPS coordinate where the laser was tracking and rides that in instead. That is the kind of backup system that separates a weapon designed by people who have actually had to fly combat missions from one designed only on paper. It is forgiving of the chaos that a real strike package runs into. That matters a lot when you are operating over hostile airspace with active air defenses still in the fight. I also want to put this weapon in its proper historical line for a second because it helps explain why the Pentagon keeps reaching for this specific class of bomb in this specific war. Bunker busters as a concept go back decades, but the modern line really starts with the GBU-28, a laser-guided penetrator rushed into service during the Gulf War because commanders needed something that could get into hardened Iraqi command bunkers that nothing else in the inventory could touch. That same basic bloodline of weapons has shown up again and again in the years since, used against hardened underground facilities tied to Hezbollah leadership, and now against Iran's own underground network in this current war. Still, that back and forth is basically the whole story of underground warfare in one sentence. It is also worth noting this is not even the first time the GBU-72 has been used in this specific campaign. Earlier reporting from Central Command described this same weapon being used along Iran's coastline near the Strait of Hormuz, targeting hardened sites believed to be housing coastal defense cruise missiles and anti-ship missiles Iran had placed there specifically to threaten naval and commercial traffic moving through the strait. So what we are watching now is not a one-off headline event. It is a continuation of a pattern that has been building for months, with the target set simply shifting from coastal anti-ship missile sites to the deeper ballistic missile production and storage network farther inland. Same weapon, same basic logic, just a different part of Iran's overall arsenal getting taken apart. And why the F-15E specifically for this mission? This is where doctrine and logistics actually come together in a pretty elegant way. The Strike Eagle is a two-seat, twin-engine fighter that can carry a heavy payload and still fight its way in and out if it needs to, which makes it a natural platform to sling a 5,000 lb penetrator underneath. But the bigger point is speed of response. If a high-value underground target gets confirmed by intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, commanders do not need to scramble a B-1 all the way from a base like Diego Garcia and spend the hours that takes just to get wheels up and then in range. If F-15s are already forward deployed in the region, which they are, you can task a two-ship formation that is sitting inside a 30-45 minute, maybe 1 hour flight from the target, get bombs on that facility, and get those jets home, all inside a window that denies the enemy time to spread out or reinforce. That is the whole logic of this strike. Get in, hit exactly where the intelligence says the target is, and get out before anyone on the ground even fully understands what happened. Now, let's talk about Iran, because they are predictably not staying quiet about any of this. Statements coming out of Iranian leadership are framing this strike as reckless and warning that what they are calling wrong strategies and impulsive decisions are going to reset the entire board, with promises that the world will see a very different Iran going forward. That is the rhetoric. Here is the reality underneath the rhetoric. The same complexes that keep getting hit are the ones housing the ballistic missile stockpile that Iran has spent 40 years and enormous resources building as its main deterrent and its main leverage at any negotiating table. Every one of these strikes is not just property damage, it is a direct hit against the single asset Iran is counting on to walk away from this war with something that still looks like strength. So when you hear defiant language out of Tehran right now, understand that it is coming from a position where their real playing pieces are being taken off the board one facility at a time. And it is not just rhetoric. The IRGC Navy has also declared again that the Strait of Hormuz is closed to all vessels, with a warning that any ship trying to pass through will be targeted. Hours after making that declaration, Iran actually acted on it, launching a pair of attack drones at a tanker moving through the strait under cover of darkness. Here is what actually happened next. The U.S. Navy and Air Force, working together, intercepted both drones before they ever reached the tanker, and that ship kept sailing safely, one of literally hundreds of vessels now moving through protected corridors in the strait every day. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and Central Command have both confirmed that commercial traffic is moving and moving safely, which tells you something important. Under all the noise, Iran is publicly declaring a blockade it does not currently have the ability to enforce. They are announcing closures they cannot actually close, while the U.S. and partner navies keep the real flow of global commerce moving through one of the most strategically vital waterways on the planet. There is a difference between making a threat and being able to back it up. And right now, that gap is on full display. Think about what a blockade announcement is actually supposed to do in the first place. It is a signal meant to scare shippers, drive up insurance prices on tankers, and pressure global energy markets into reacting before a single ship is ever actually stopped. That is the theory. But when hundreds of vessels are still making that trip safely day after day, with naval escort and active air defense standing by to intercept anything launched at them, the real deterrent value of that announcement starts to fade fast. Shippers and insurers pay much more attention to what is really happening in the water than to what is being posted by a government press office. And right now, what is really happening in the water is safe passage. That does not mean the risk is zero, and it does not mean Iran cannot get lucky with a future attempt. But it does mean the credibility of that blockade threat is taking a real hit every single day it fails to turn into an actual closure. This also tells you something about escalation control on both sides. Iran is choosing to signal aggression through drones and rhetoric rather than through a direct, larger-scale conventional fight with the US Navy. Almost certainly because they understand exactly how one-sided that kind of direct fight would be for them right now, and the US response so far has been proportional and defensive in nature, intercepting the real threats to shipping without escalating into a broader offensive campaign against Iranian naval assets themselves. Both sides appear to be trying to make a point without triggering the kind of uncontrolled escalation that neither side actually wants at this stage of the war. That is a delicate balance, and it is one that can shift very quickly if a future drone or missile attempt actually hits a vessel instead of getting intercepted. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic side, things are, to put it mildly, messy. President Trump posted on Truth Social suggesting a deal to end this war looked imminent, that terms had reportedly been agreed to at the highest levels of Iranian leadership and would be signed this weekend. Then, within hours, parts of Iranian leadership pushed back, saying nothing had actually been signed. And look, this is not necessarily a contradiction. It is a symptom of something much more revealing, cracks inside the Iranian leadership structure itself. You have factions that appear willing to sign something just to get out from under this bombing campaign, and other factions unwilling to admit that publicly or possibly unaware that talks had reached that point at all. When one part of a government is negotiating a way out and another part is publicly denying it exists, that is not strong, unified leadership speaking with one voice. That is a government under enough pressure that its internal seams are starting to show. President Trump also posted separately, and rather bluntly, criticizing what he described as Iran leaking distorted terms to the press that do not match what was actually agreed to in writing, calling their public statements dishonorable, and saying there is no such thing as dealing with them in good faith. He also pointed to that drone attack on shipping near the strait as completely unacceptable, and made it clear that Iran needs to get its house in order quickly. Now, I want to address something directly because you are going to see plenty of corporate media coverage try to frame this administration and this military campaign in the worst possible light. We have watched that pattern for months at this point. But look at what is actually happening on the ground. Central Command stepped up enforcement in the strait, intercepted attack drones aimed at a commercial vessel, and kept hundreds of ships moving safely through what Iran is calling a closed waterway. That is not the story you will hear from every outlet, but it is the story the real operational picture tells. That is exactly why places like this exist, to walk you through what the primary sources and the on-the-ground reporting actually show, rather than what gets filtered through a news cycle looking for the angriest possible headline. Let's shift gears now and actually look at the ground itself, because I think seeing the terrain helps all of this click into place. We are going to zoom into Isfahan, Iran, one of the regions that has already absorbed strikes from the larger GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator earlier in this war, and now reportedly the GBU-72 as well. The Persian Gulf sits to the south, which gives you the general direction we are working with. As we move in closer, you start to see something that looks less like a single bunker and more like an entire underground missile city dug straight into the mountainside on the edge of the city. Overhead imagery from earlier construction phases shows exactly how a facility like this gets built over time. Separate warehouse structures, dedicated storage bays, access roads carved specifically to feed vehicles and equipment into tunnel entrances that burrow straight into the rock. This is a build designed from day one to house ballistic missile stockpiles deep enough that normal air power simply could not reach them, at least until now. And if you look at the entrances themselves, you will notice they are deliberately hardened and deliberately plain from a distance, tucked into terrain that looks like nothing more than a rough hillside unless you know exactly what you are looking for. That is intentional. Iran's entire underground strategy revolves around blending these facilities into harsh, forgettable landscape, spreading out multiple entry and exit points so that missiles can be moved deep into the mountain for storage, then rolled back out to a launch position, fired and pulled back underground before a retaliatory strike can find them. Multiple exit points mean multiple ways to survive. That is the whole doctrine in one sentence. This is the same basic logic North Korea has used for decades with its own underground missile and artillery network along the DMZ. And it is the same logic Hezbollah used in Beirut before its own underground command facilities got targeted. Dig deep, spread wide, build back up into every layer, and bet that no enemy is willing to spend an unlimited number of expensive precision weapons chasing every single possible entrance. It is a patient generational strategy, and up until weapons like the GBU-72 entered service in meaningful numbers, it was a reasonably effective one. It also means Iran has every reason right now to start building decoy sites next to the real ones, structures made specifically to look like real bunker complexes on satellite imagery, hoping to bait the US into spending an expensive penetrator weapon on an empty hole in the ground, which is exactly why intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance work matters as much as the bomb itself. The weapon is only as good as the targeting behind it. And right now, we are watching Iran's underground strategy get picked apart almost in real time. So here is the tactical problem underneath all of this, and it is one that does not get talked about nearly enough. Iran's missile reserves around Isfahan are not sitting out in the open on some launch pad waiting to be hit by a standard JDAM. They are built into what is believed to be one of the largest missile assembly and production complexes in the entire country, engineered across roughly 4 decades, specifically to survive a sustained conventional bombing campaign. That is not a target you casually walk up to. That is a target built by people who studied exactly what air power can and cannot do and spent decades trying to stay one step ahead of it. Reports say this general area has already absorbed something close to 20 separate bunker buster strikes across this war from B-2s, from B-52s, from F-15E sorties, and yet there are still accounts of missiles rising back out of those same mountains the following morning. Why does that keep happening? Because the real storage depth these complexes reach into the mountain goes well beyond what earlier strikes were able to touch. You have to go deeper to actually end the threat, not just damage the entrance. And that is the specific gap the GBU-72 is now being used to close. If you zoom out and look at the order of this entire campaign, there is a clear logic to it. Early phases targeted radar sites and communication infrastructure, basically blinding and deafening Iran's ability to coordinate a response. The next phase moved into command and control, cutting the nervous system that connects decision makers to the forces in the field. And now we are watching strikes move specifically into ballistic missile production and storage, the real muscle behind Iran's ability to strike back or to hold leverage at a negotiating table. That is not a random sequence. It reads like a campaign designed with an endpoint in mind, systematically stripping away Iran's options in the order that most efficiently forces a decision. Whether that decision comes from exhaustion, from leadership fractures, or from simply running out of stockpile to threaten anyone with. Which brings us to the real question sitting underneath everything we have talked about today. What does Iran actually want out of this, and what is the US actually trying to accomplish? From Iran's side, it comes down to money to rebuild the infrastructure that is being destroyed, and a strong preference to keep any final ballistic missile stockpile numbers out of whatever agreement eventually gets signed. Iran understands that the US is drawing its hardest line around the nuclear program, so whether they ultimately give up all of it, some of it, or manage to stall that conversation entirely remains to be seen. But underneath that nuclear conversation is this quieter, and arguably more important, fight over the missile stockpile, because that stockpile is what Iran believes keeps everything else standing. If you are sitting on 10 or 15,000 ballistic missiles, that arsenal effectively acts as an insurance policy for the rest of the program, nuclear ambitions included, drone capability included, and any hope of keeping leverage over shipping through the Strait of Hormuz included. Take that stockpile away piece by piece, mountain by mountain, and everything else Iran is trying to protect becomes much more exposed. That is what is really at stake in these bunker buster strikes, and it is why this specific target set keeps getting hit again and again instead of the campaign simply declaring victory and moving on. Before we close out, let's do a quick lap around a couple of other developments worth knowing about, because it is worth staying oriented on the bigger picture beyond just this one theater. The Senate Armed Services Committee has advanced legislation to stand up a full combatant command dedicated specifically to robotics and autonomous systems at the same 4-star command tier as Central Command itself. It is a major signal about where military investment and doctrine are heading. Drones, autonomous systems, and AI-enabled platforms are only going to become a bigger part of how future conflicts get fought. And we are already seeing hints of that in this campaign, including reports of an autonomous drone boat helping in the rescue of a downed helicopter crew. Keep your eye on that space, because a dedicated combatant command means resources, doctrine, and career pathways are all about to scale up around this technology in a way that is going to shape the next decade of warfare. So where does this leave us? You have a war where the physical campaign is speeding up, with bunker buster strikes systematically dismantling Iran's underground missile infrastructure, while the diplomatic track is at the very same time showing signs of real movement and real fracture. That is not a contradiction. That is what pressure actually looks like from inside a government that is absorbing this level of sustained damage to its most protected assets. Some factions want out, others are not ready to admit it publicly. And in the middle of all of that, commercial shipping keeps moving through the Strait of Hormuz because the US Navy and Air Force are actively making sure it does, no matter what gets declared from Tehran. One more thing is worth sitting with before we wrap up. Wars like this one rarely end with a single dramatic moment, a signature or a surrender that closes the book cleanly. They usually end the way this one is unfolding right now, messily, with strikes and negotiations happening on parallel tracks that do not always agree with each other, with factions inside a government pulling in different directions depending on who is speaking and on what day. What we are watching right now, a bunkerbuster strike one day and talk of an imminent signed deal the next, followed right away by denial from another faction, is exactly what that messy middle phase looks like from the outside. It is not necessarily a sign the process is failing. It might just as easily be a sign that it is working, that the pressure is real enough to split leadership into camps that want out and camps that are not ready to admit defeat publicly yet. The next few days are honestly going to tell us a lot about which camp actually wins that internal argument. I want to hear from you on this one. Do you think we are going to see more of these bunker-buster strikes in the days ahead? Or do you think the diplomatic track wins out and we get an actual signed deal before this escalates any further? Drop your take in the comments. I read every one of them, and I genuinely want to know where you think this is heading. If you want more of this kind of breakdown, the kind that walks through the real weapon systems, the real terrain, and the real strategy rather than just reacting to a headline, make sure you are following along because we are going to keep tracking the story as it develops, strike by strike and deal by deal. Thanks for spending this time with me today. I will see you in the next one.